2026 Project Management Professional, or PMP exam. If you want to understand how modern projects actually succeed and how to pass that newly updated exam, you are in exactly the right place. To make sure we maximize our time together, here's our game plan. We're going to start with the PMBOK global shift, followed by defining Agile Value 2. Then we'll contrast traditional versus adaptive mindsets, uncover the dreaded watermelon project risk, break down quality gates and efficiency, and finally, lock in the key PMP exam vocabulary you absolutely need to know.
Section 1, the PMBOK Global Shift. New 2026 PMP exam.
Now, you might be wondering, why is this material so urgently relevant to you right now? Well, it's because the whole landscape of project management certification and execution is fundamentally changing. The new domain weightings are a massive wake-up call. We've got process at 41%, people at 33%, and business environment at 26%. You really need to pay attention to that business environment number. It represents a massive jump. It's tripling in weight from 8% up to 26%. This isn't just some minor tweak. It's a giant flashing signal from the Project Management Institute about what truly matters in modern project execution.
Mark your calendars for July 9th, 2026. That's the launch date, and it comes right alongside a 60% adaptive content focus. This shift, it signifies a radical pivot toward outcomes versus simply output. You know, in the past, generating a massive stack of documents was considered a perfectly valid output, but today, no way. The exam and honestly, the entire business world demands actual, measurable outcomes. It's all about what tangible value you are bringing to the business environment.
Section 2, defining Agile Value. 2, outcomes over outputs.
So, let's get into the foundational concept we are decoding today, the philosophical engine driving this whole shift to outcomes. The original Agile Manifesto puts it like this: while there is value in project documentation and plans, we value functional, validated product delivery more. I want you to burn this catchphrase into your brain: progress over paperwork. Now, that doesn't mean documentation is dead or useless. It simply means that when push comes to shove, having a working product is infinitely more valuable than having a perfectly formatted plan for a product that doesn't even exist yet.
In practice, success is measured by the delivery of a functional, validated product rather than just checking the box on administrative paperwork. The top priority has to be working software, meaning tested, genuinely usable product increments. What we are aggressively moving away from is comprehensive documentation, which usually just means rigid upfront specs that inevitably delay physical validation. Think about dashboards, sales funnels, actual working tools. That is what your stakeholders want to see, not a giant Word document promising that those tools might eventually exist.
Section 3, traditional versus adaptive mindsets. Predictive versus adaptive.
So how do we actually make that shift? The core difference really comes down to timing and commitment. The traditional approach relies heavily on exhaustive upfront planning, basically trying to predict every single variable before a single line of code is written. The adaptive mindset, on the other hand, fully embraces incremental and just-in-time action. It's all about adjusting to reality as it actually happens.
When we trace the exact vectors of this shift, the differences are night and day. Take the primary purpose of documentation. Traditional projects use it as a baseline, a rigid contract, or for risk mitigation. But in Agile, documentation is purely a communication and support tool. For timing, as we just mentioned, it's exhaustive up front versus incremental and just in time. Then there's a success metric. Predictive models look at planned adherence, your typical static status report. Agile looks at functional product increments. And finally, storage. We move away from static documents, like those incredibly heavy business requirement documents, and shift to living artifacts, like wikis and markdown files, that seamlessly evolve right alongside the product.
Let's ground this in reality with a quick comparison. Consider scenario A, a total predictive failure. A finance enterprise spent 9 solid months drafting a 450-page requirement document. That's practically a novel nobody wants to read. Meanwhile, a competitor launched superior tech during that exact planning phase. By the time they finished writing, 40% of those meticulously crafted documents were completely obsolete before coding even started. That resulted in a devastating 12-month market delay. Now contrast that with scenario B, an adaptive success. A health tech startup used progressive prototyping. They built a clickable wireframe in just 2 weeks. The backlog was iteratively refined based on real clinician feedback, and they delivered the whole thing in 3 months. That right there is the sheer power of working software over comprehensive documentation.
Section 4, the watermelon project risk. False sense of security.
Now, what actually happens when we ignore this reality? We get trapped in this false sense of security.
It's called the watermelon project. Just think about a watermelon. It's bright green on the outside, but totally red on the inside. This happens when over-documentation makes a project look green and perfectly healthy on all the status reports. Hey, you hit all your documentation milestones perfectly. But internally, the project is red and failing because absolutely zero functional value has been verified. Heavy upfront specs just represent unvalidated assumptions. When you're sitting on a stale inventory of requirements, it inevitably leads to massive, super expensive rework the second the user finally sees the actual product.
Section 5. Quality gates and efficiency. Tactical Agile execution.
To avoid those doomed watermelon projects, Agile methodologies prevent failure through strict, embedded quality controls. Every single requirement takes a sequential journey. It starts at the definition of ready, where a story is crystal clear, estimated, and prioritized. Then it jumps into the sprint iteration for collaborative development and testing. After that comes the sprint review, which is all about live functional product validation. And finally, it reaches the definition of done, where the code is officially reviewed, tested, and properly documented.
Successfully passing a requirement from the definition of ready all the way to the definition of done establishes the absolute golden rule for your exam and for your career. Working software is the primary measure of progress, not the approval of a massive requirements document, not the sign-off on a design phase. Only working software that has successfully passed through these strict quality gates proves actual, tangible progress.
To manage this pipeline efficiently, adaptive teams actually use specific mathematical formulas to prioritize and track their progress. Two you absolutely need to know are WSJF and TCPI. WSJF stands for Weighted Shortest Job First, and it's calculated by dividing the cost of delay by the job size. Then we have TCPI, the Two Complete Performance Index, which is calculated as the budget at completion minus earned value, divided by the budget at completion minus actual cost.
For the exam, lock these concepts into your mental dashboard. By dividing the cost of delay by the job size for WSJF prioritization, Agile teams ensure that the highest score results in the maximum value delivery at the fastest possible rate. It's literally how you mathematically choose what to build first. And then for efficiency, that TCPI formula tells you the exact productivity rate required for your remaining project work to actually hit your financial targets. These aren't just random math problems to memorize. They are essential, practical tools for ensuring your working software is actually delivering real business value efficiently.
Section 6. Key PMP exam vocabulary. Critical Agile terms.
All right, we are in the home stretch. To ensure maximum retention before test day, I'm going to rapid-fire list these critical terms just to prime your brain. You absolutely must know these 6 terms: barely sufficient, just in time, information radiator, definition of done, potentially shippable, and MVP. Let's drill down into exactly what the source material says about these.
Digging into our master list here. First up, barely sufficient. This refers to the optimal documentation level required to meet needs without creating waste. Remember, we still document things, but only what's absolutely necessary. Next, just-in-time, or JIT, means detailing user stories immediately prior to execution, not 6 months in advance. An information radiator is a highly visual, single source of truth, like a big Kanban board everyone can see. The definition of done is your primary quality gate for functional verification. Potentially shippable is the absolute core metric of empirical progress. Simply put, if it's not potentially shippable, you haven't made progress. And finally, MVP, the minimum viable product, which is used specifically to gather functional feedback as quickly as possible.
To really tie all these terms together, let's look at a prototyping strategy. Think back to that healthcare advantage we talked about earlier. Teams constructing clickable, high-fidelity wireframes to serve as visual communication tools. This is the perfect, concrete example of just-in-time documentation. The documentation was generated just in time as the software code stabilized, ensuring the artifacts matched reality perfectly. The wireframe itself is the documentation, and it proves functional value long before a giant text document ever could. Well, we've covered a tremendous amount of ground today, from the massive 26% shift toward the business environment domain on the new exam, all the way to avoiding that incredibly deceptive watermelon project. So, I want to leave you with this final provocative question. How will you adapt your project management style for the July 2026 shift? Will you remain stuck in exhaustive upfront planning, or will you champion functional, validated product delivery?
The choice is entirely yours, but the exam, and honestly the industry as a whole, is undeniably moving toward adaptation and real-world value. Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer. Keep mastering these concepts, always prioritize progress over paperwork, and I just know you are going to absolutely crush the 2026 PMP exam. Keep learning, keep adapting, and I'll catch you in the next one.
Learning reinforcement.
This visualizes the new exam domain weights for the Project Management Institute's PMBOK Guide 8th edition and the updated PMP examination content outline. The process domain sits at 41%, people at 33%, and business environment surges to 26%. Crucially, approximately 60% of this updated examination focuses on adaptive and hybrid project scenarios. Because the majority of the exam now evaluates these scenarios, a deep, practical understanding of the Agile Manifesto is a prerequisite for passing. This brings us to the second core value of Agile: working software over comprehensive documentation. The operative word here is over. The authors valued the items on the right, but they valued the items on the left more. Yet PMP candidates consistently struggle with situational questions regarding this specific value. They struggle because of a deeply ingrained cognitive reflex known as the predictive bias. Conditioned by traditional waterfall environments, practitioners operating with a predictive bias automatically equate exhaustive upfront planning and administrative sign-offs with risk mitigation. When practitioners prioritize these bureaucratic procedures over functional delivery, they introduce severe cognitive friction. This instinct to default to heavy paperwork over usable outputs impacts both exam scores and real-world projects. The pioneers of Agile were reacting directly to the realities of late 20th century software engineering. At the time, heavyweight, plan-driven methodologies dominated the industry. Teams were required to spend months, sometimes years, generating descriptive administrative paperwork before writing a single line of functional code. This created a massive lag between customer requirements and physical validation. Relying on this exhaustive documentation creates a critical project vulnerability. It generates a false sense of security where teams measure their progress against a static baseline rather than a working product. In an adaptive environment, extensive upfront documentation acts as a liability. It serves as a massive inventory of unvalidated assumptions that are highly susceptible to shifting market conditions and customer needs. The direct result of this false security is the watermelon project phenomenon. The project appears perfectly healthy and green on status reports and documentation audits, but it is failing, or red, internally, because no functional value has been verified by the customer. Working software solves this exact problem. In modern delivery, working software refers to any operational, tested, and usable increment of a product capable of generating immediate business value. This diagram compares two development timelines. The top timeline represents case scenario A, a financial enterprise building a mobile banking app, trapped by the predictive bias. They spent 9 months drafting a 450-page business requirements document. In the 9th month, a competitor launched an application with a superior biometric authentication protocol. Instantly, 40% of the enterprise's documented specifications were rendered obsolete, resulting in massive change control requests and severe delays. The bottom timeline represents case scenario B, an adaptive healthcare startup avoiding heavy upfront specs. They spent 2 weeks constructing a clickable wireframe, followed by 3 months of iterative delivery. By utilizing a progressive prototyping strategy, the team gathered actionable feedback directly from clinical users, refining their requirements based on actual usage rather than theoretical assumptions. Delivering functional increments early establishes an empirical feedback loop. Stakeholders validate the product in real time, minimizing the risk of scope misalignment and significantly reducing the cost of defect remediation. There is a persistent myth that Agile projects completely reject documentation. They do not. Agile projects mandate that documentation must be barely sufficient to meet its intended purpose and satisfy organizational governance. This is achieved through just-in-time, or JIT, requirements analysis. Agile teams defer the detailing of requirements to the last responsible moment, preventing wasted effort on items that may never be built. This flowchart illustrates the mechanical pipeline governing this process, beginning with the definition of ready. The definition of ready ensures a backlog item has enough clarity to enter execution without blocking the cross-functional team. explicitly confirming the item is sized and prioritized by business value. Once execution concludes, the item passes through the definition of done. This acts as the ultimate quality standard, confirming that every completed user story meets all required benchmarks. Essential, lightweight technical documentation, such as wiki updates, compliance forms, and automated code comments, is embedded directly into this definition of done. The item cannot be marked complete without it. By integrating documentation tasks directly into the definition of done, project managers prevent the buildup of documentation debt. The artifacts evolve dynamically, perfectly in sync with the working software. To manage this flow, project managers must mathematically sequence backlog items to maximize functional value and minimize complexity. This formula illustrates the weighted shortest job first, or WSJF prioritization model, derived from lean software development. The numerator, cost of delay, is calculated by adding the combined score of user and business value, time criticality, and risk reduction or opportunity enablement. By dividing that score by the job size, teams identify the highest WSJF score. The PMP examination evaluates your mastery of Agile Value 2 through situational scenarios, where project goals and administrative requirements conflict. The first rule is progress over paperwork. If a scenario presents a choice between completing a design document and demonstrating a working feature to a stakeholder, always choose the option that focuses on demonstrating the feature and gathering feedback. The second rule is that documentation is tailored, not eliminated. Avoid selecting answers that advocate for the complete removal of documentation. On a hybrid project, the correct path is ensuring documentation is barely sufficient. Third, resolve compliance via the backlog. Mandatory regulatory or audit documents must be decomposed into backlog items, prioritized by the product owner, and delivered incrementally. They should not be pushed to a separate plan-heavy phase. Fourth, address bottlenecks through the definition of done. If team members fail to document their work, the correct action is to facilitate a team discussion to update the DoD. This ensures collective ownership of essential artifacts without resorting to rigid administrative escalation. These strategies map directly to the core principles of the PMBOK Guide 8th edition, specifically the mandates to focus on value and build an empowered culture. While project documentation remains a necessary component for governance and compliance, prioritizing the continuous delivery of a functional, validated product is the only true measure of project success. In July 2026, the PMP exam adopts a specific change in domain weighting. The Project Management Institute is moving focus toward the external business environment. This chart breaks down the new exam weights. The business environment domain is tripling in value. The updated curriculum also mandates a 60% focus on adaptive methodologies, moving away from rigid adherence to a static plan. This creates friction for managers trained to believe that exhaustive documentation is the primary method to reduce project risk. Predictive leaders often rely on business requirements documents, which reach hundreds of pages, to create a sense of security before any code is ever written. Relying on administrative paperwork instead of measurable execution creates a systemic vulnerability within modern enterprise projects. We see this vulnerability in projects where every executive status report claims the initiative is healthy and on track. This is a watermelon project. The exterior looks green and healthy, but the internal reality is red, actively failing. Heavy upfront specs create this illusion, representing unvalidated assumptions, not verified progress, which leads to costly rework when markets shift. A green status report offers little security if it isn't backed by actual value delivered to the end user. Risk reduction is a function of measurable functional progress via working software. To prevent this watermelon effect, we must examine the operational differences between rigid predictive frameworks and flexible adaptive ones. On the predictive side, exhaustive documentation establishes a baseline contract to mitigate blame. On the adaptive side, success is measured through the delivery of functional product increments. Consider Scenario A. A finance enterprise spent 9 months drafting a 450-page requirements document. Because a competitor launched superior tech, 40% of that documentation became obsolete. This massive pile of stale, unvalidated assumptions ultimately resulted in a devastating 12-month market delay. Conversely, scenario B shows a health tech startup using progressive prototyping. They iteratively refined their backlog and achieved successful delivery in just 3 months. Exhaustive upfront planning risks complete irrelevance when the global market evolves faster than a traditional team's documentation cycle can ever keep up with. This leads to the question of execution. How do adaptive teams capture complex requirements without a massive upfront document? Our health tech startup replaced static text with clickable, high-fidelity wireframes, serving as an immediate visual communication tool for all stakeholders. Formal documentation was then generated just in time, only after the software code stabilized, ensuring the artifacts perfectly matched reality. This just-in-time documentation means user stories are detailed immediately prior to execution. This pairs perfectly with an information radiator, a visual single source of truth like a Kanban board. Combining just-in-time documentation with visual prototypes entirely eliminates the stale inventory risk that leads to failing projects. Adaptive teams must still gate quality and prevent scope creep, but they achieve this without relying on comprehensive upfront specifications. The empirical progress pipeline begins with the definition of ready. This quality gate ensures that user stories are clear, estimated, and prioritized before development starts. Work then moves into the sprint iteration and onto the sprint review, where progress is judged exclusively by live functional product validation. Returning to the pipeline, the final quality gate is the definition of done, ensuring the resulting code is thoroughly reviewed, tested, and documented. Passing this final gate yields a potentially shippable product increment, which serves as the definitive core metric of empirical progress. These stringent quality gates redirect a team's entire focus away from checking administrative boxes and toward validating actual functional outcomes. These adaptive gates are the basis for the financial tracking required by enterprise PMOs and the PMP exam. Metrics used in adaptive environments rely on the empirical outcomes established at the definition of done. This is the weighted shortest job first formula. It is the method used to prioritize work based on maximum value delivery. Financial targets are tracked through the TCPI efficiency formula, which calculates the productivity required to meet a project's budget. A project manager cannot accurately calculate the cost of delay or earned value when those calculations are based on the unvalidated assumptions found in a traditional requirements document. Precise financial tracking relies on the constant empirical feedback loops generated by working software. These formulas reflect the broader philosophy of the July 2026 exam shift. Documentation in this environment is governed by the barely sufficient principle. The barely sufficient principle targets the optimal level of documentation needed to meet compliance while eliminating administrative waste. While traditional project plans still hold baseline value, they are now secondary to the delivery of the product itself. Validated product delivery is the only true measure of project progress. Mastering this shift from output to outcome is the central requirement for passing the 2026 PMP exam and leading resilient projects.